All right, hi, I'm
Hi.
Rabbi Daniel Brenner,
Hi, I'm Rabbi Tamara Cohen.
and over the last couple of weeks, we just had an incredible experience training folks from about 90 different summer camps, Jewish summer camps around North America. And it's all part of the Foundation for Jewish Camps Shmira initiative. And Tamara, could you just say a little bit about what role that we played in the initiative and what we did?
Sure. It was very exciting to learn with and from all those camp directors. And our training was on gender, sex, and power at Jewish summer camp. And what we did was we really arranged it around sharing some tools for training this summer. And we want to share a few of them with you.
Yeah. So one of the things that we did was we talked about the framework of just big picture, where is sexism happening at camp, before we talked about issues like sexual harassment or sexual assault. And the tools that we're going to share today really are, one of them is more like a big picture tool, which is like trying to learn a little bit about camp culture. And the second is more geared towards specifically the interaction that happens between counselors and campers, and around some of the guidelines between counselors and campers. So let's just get started into the tools, and if you could say a little bit about the model of action research for the first tool, why we use that, and a little bit about the tool.
So we've been using this tool for a few years now, but really did a lot of work with it last year and had 25 different camps participate. And across the board, we found that it was a wonderful way to engage each other, to engage staff in a real conversation about what's going on around sexism and specifically issues of sexual harassment. Added more of that in this year at camp, and to do that in a way that was really interactive and engaging, and also that gathers research for camps about what's really going on. And so the tool is an interview tool where pairs are interviewing each other on a series of questions that we ask, all about language at camp, sexism, gender issues, sexual orientation issues. So it's about perception, it's about focusing in on what's really going on in different areas of camp around crushes and romance, and also harassment. And that context is important because we're not just trying to stem the worst things from happening, but trying to address everything that's going on in general about messages about gender, sex, and sexuality at camp, whether or not we realize that all that is going on.
Yeah, and I think it even asks the question specifically about what are the positive messages you've learned from being in the camp environment, and what are some of the messages that are really not so positive. One of the things that I learned in teaching this tool is that the tool is really designed for specifically for people who grew up at the camp or have had previous experience at the camp, because it's really getting at like what are the camp culture, what have they observed in the past. So one of the things that I remember, people asking me was, well, what if you have new staff? So this is a tool that I think can be used to help new staff. So whether it's your staff from overseas or new American staff, to really understand the camp culture if they participate as an observer or they participate by asking the questions. But really, the questions are really asking everybody who has been at the camp before to like really recall their experiences and to reflect on those
Yeah, there are
things.
two things that came up around that. One was the option of using it somewhat into the camp season as a way of kind of taking a measure of what's really going
Taking
on.
the pulse.
And taking the pulse. And so in that case, it could be a mix of staff that have been there for a long time and new staff, and that also recognizing that one of the obstacles to changing things at camp for the better is that counselors are so embedded in what was their experience as a camper, and this is what was done for me. Whether it was positive or negative, I'm attached to it because it was special to me, and so I
Sure.
want to replicate that, so that this could be a way of actually surfacing that issue and naming it, that we may be talking about changing some cherished ways that it was for you, but here's why we need to change them, because we're thinking now differently about what it means to create a safe camp environment for every camper.
Yeah, what I really like about that exercise is that first it just like respects that everyone has a different experience. That you could be in the same camp and even in the same bunk, but have a totally different experience than somebody else in that environment. But it also gives you an opportunity at the end when you start talking about, well, what did we learn from all these questions, and taking a look at different the different ratings that people gave and the things that people are concerned about, the age of the campers that are feeling sexual pressure, all of those things. It gives you an opportunity to say, how do we want to do things differently? What pressures do we want to turn down? What do we want to just be aware of? What do we want to look at? What do we want to see?
Yeah, and one of the things that we have suggested is that after doing an activity like that, it might be an opportunity to come up with a few volunteers who want to be thinking this throughout the rest of the summer, because one of the ideas behind action research is you're part of finding out what's going on, diagnosing the issues, and then also part of creating the solution. And to give staff the opportunity to be part of both of those experiences can be really empowering to staff and help create change.
Yeah. One other thing about this tool that I think is important to relay to folks is that it takes at least an hour for people to interview each other and really go in depth with the interviews and process it a little bit. And probably would be better to actually spend more time talking about it because from our experience at least, we found that once people take the interview and start talking to each other about it, there's a lot more that's coming up.
And I have also found that it's helpful to have some time to look over the data to see what's jumping out and what specifically you might want to address as leadership in terms of, I noticed a lot of people are saying, for example, they don't know where to go if they need to report something. How can we talk about that in another time or in the next staff meeting, whatever. So I think thinking through how you're actually going to use the data, if you want it to be anonymous, if you want to do it with all your camp staff, or just focus on camp staff of one age group, and then are you going to actually compile it? Are you going to just look through it and try to notice trends and think about what you as leadership want to do with what you've compiled is another piece of it, in addition to just the conversations that happen when people are doing it themselves.
Yeah, that's great. So let's focus a little bit on the second tool, which are the guidelines between counselors and campers. I feel like there's always this desire by counselors that grew up at a camp, to be the person who the camper goes to with every question about romance and sexuality and sexual orientation and gender expression. And I feel like one of the reasons that people love to be a camp counselor and love to be a staff member of camp is because you get to have that kind of conversation. And these guidelines are challenging that a little bit, but also trying to define the role of the counselor.
I think that they've been really appreciated because there's a time where it's helpful to just have a few lines that are here's what I can say when I'm in this uncomfortable situation. We've thought about it, we've talked about it, we've improved the guidelines from so much feedback from various camp professionals, but counselors really appreciate, and we've been told that counselors really appreciate having some specifics of here's what I should do in those situations that help me both still be the mentor that I want to be and offer some advice and answers and be open and supporting the growth of my campers, but doing that in a way that is appropriate and boundaried and safe and not oversharing, and knowing when I need help to get help and when not to, and when I can handle it myself, and that's what the guidelines do. So our suggestion is to use these in some way to make them work for your camp. So if you have specific policies or rules that are not reflected in there, to adapt them, but that some of the language is really a helpful way to engage counselors in the conversation, in understanding here's what to do in these situations. and that the guidelines is one really helpful way to do it, and then perhaps to bring that to life through doing some role plays based on the guidelines so they can actually practice, not just knowing what to say, but actually practice, how do I feel with this coming out of my mouth? How am I going to say it and make it authentically something that I would say to my bunk?
I remember a camp training I was doing at one summer camp, and they were having a lot of fun just having to respond to, what if you had a 14-year-old camper said, hey, how do you French kiss? And like, how do you respond to that? Like, and every staff member had a different way to respond to that, and was really challenged by how do they respond to that. But one of the things that I liked about the boundaries was that it got into everybody's head, this is not my time to tell my story about my first French kiss.
Right.
Like, everybody was like, okay, I gotta stop and not tell that story, because that's kind of my go-to story, but I don't want to do that because I want this camper to have the experience that they're going to have. I don't want to impose an expectation on this camper. I don't want to be telling this camper that they should rush into something if they shouldn't be rushing into something. And my experience is different than their experience, and my experience can be private and doesn't have to be shared with the camper. So I definitely heard in what you were saying, like how it helps staff to feel better about themselves. It really does help them reflect a little bit, and then gets them to think what's behind that question.
Exactly. That, I think that's so much what it's about, is not just, oh, a question was asked, how do I answer it? But how can I stop for a moment, think about, what is this question really, what's really being asked, and what are my options, and how to respond to the larger thing that's going on here, not just the on the surface question that's being asked. And counselors need that help, and hopefully this tool can really help you provide that.
Yeah. The other thing I've heard about the guidelines, which I do think is important, is that when you just say no, prohibited, that's prohibited, you can't do that, and you don't convey the value,
Yes.
It leads to more frustration.
So important.
And it's frustrating as a staff member to do that, and it's frustrating for the camper. And I think that the guidelines here are ones which try to convey the values in a clear way, and also say that, we're trying to create a safe environment at camp. We're trying to turn down the pressure at camp, and we're trying to make sure that everyone feels respected. So I think in addition to the role plays, even just having people look at each one of the guidelines and talk out, how does this impact what we're doing here? If you had a large staff and you had have a small group look at each one of the guidelines and say what the guideline was and what they learned in their conversation before you all looked at the guidelines all together, I think that would be very helpful. It's a couple of pages, but I think each one of the guidelines has stories attached to it and experiences
Absolutely.
attached to it.
And there's also a section at the end of the guidelines with some suggestions if you wanted to bring in Jewish values and teachings and do it with a Jewish educator that I know at least one camp has told us they're interested in working on this summer, as a way to, again, deepen the conversation and what's underlying it. So it's not just about compliance and rules, it's about, part of this is about really building and supporting the camp culture that we want.
Absolutely. Well, that sounds like a good introduction to these two tools. We really hope that folks have an opportunity to use them in your staff training, either at the beginning of camp or during camp,
Yes.
as we said, which these tools can both certainly be used.
And we're really interested in hearing how you use them, so
Yes.
be in touch.
Great. Thanks.